The people living in million-dollar homes laughed every time they passed the little mud house on the hill. They stopped laughing when their own walls began to crack. The first time Caleb Turner noticed people taking pictures of his house, he was fixing the roof before sunrise. The cold Colorado wind moved softly through the pine trees above Aspen Ridge, while frost still clung to the grass around his property like thin silver dust. His house sat alone at the edge of town, near the base of a rocky hill, small and uneven, built mostly from packed earth, salvaged timber, and stone he carried himself over nearly 3 years. Most people called it ugly. Some called it embarrassing. Others called it dangerous. Caleb simply called it home. Ranger sat quietly nearby beneath the wooden porch awning, watching every movement with steady amber eyes while morning fog drifted slowly across the valley below. The German shepherd barely moved except to raise his ears whenever a car passed the dirt road leading toward the luxury neighborhood above. The dog always listened first. Caleb trusted that about him. "Looks like another cold one," Caleb muttered softly while tightening a rusted nail near the roofline. Ranger blinked once before resting his head against both paws again. The little mud house stood strangely against the backdrop of Aspen Ridge's luxury estates. Less than half a mile uphill sat homes worth $2 or $3 million. Giant glass windows facing mountain views, heated driveways, oversized fireplaces, imported stone patios. Meanwhile, Caleb's place had hand-cut wood shutters, rain barrels, solar lights, and a roof patched together after every hard winter. Yet somehow, despite everything, it stayed warm. Solid. Quiet. Caleb climbed down carefully from the ladder and wiped dirt from rough hands worn by years of work nobody noticed. At 57 years old, the former Navy SEAL carried himself with the same quiet steadiness he learned long ago. Broad shoulders, slow movements, eyes that looked older than his age. He had lived through enough loss to stop explaining himself to strangers. After his wife passed from cancer 6 years earlier, medical bills had taken nearly everything. The house, savings, plans, what remained fit inside an old pickup truck and one loyal dog that refused to leave his side. So Caleb rebuilt his life one board at a time, one quiet morning at a time, one muddy wall at a time. Around 8 o'clock, the first black SUV rolled slowly past the dirt road. Then another. Caleb did not have to look up to know what came next. Laughter drifted through cracked windows. A phone camera lifted briefly. Someone pointed toward the house. Again, Ranger lifted his head immediately, ears alert. Caleb stayed focused on stacking chopped wood beside the porch. He had learned something over the years. Pride cost energy. Peace saved it. Still, some mornings hurt more than others. "Can you believe someone actually lives there?" A voice called from an open passenger window. A younger man leaned halfway out laughing. "Looks like something a raccoon built." More laughter followed. Caleb said nothing. Ranger stood slowly now, watching the SUV disappear uphill toward the gated community above. Calm but alert. Always watching. Caleb reached down and scratched lightly behind the dog's ear. "Let them laugh," he said quietly. "People laugh at what they do not understand." Ranger stayed facing the road. Something about him felt restless this morning. Strange. Like he heard something hidden beneath the silence. Later that afternoon, Caleb drove into town for supplies. Aspen Ridge looked exactly how outsiders imagined wealthy mountain towns looked. Boutique stores, stone walkways, expensive coffee shops filled with polished jackets and perfect smiles. Caleb rarely stayed long. He picked up feed for chickens, hardware supplies, and dog food before stopping near the farmer's market where a retired widow named Dorothy sold homemade pies every Saturday. Caleb helped carry boxes whenever her arthritis acted up. "Morning, Caleb," she said warmly. "How is that stubborn house surviving?" Caleb smiled faintly. "Still standing. Better than some marriages in this town," Dorothy joked quietly. Caleb laughed softly. Ranger rested patiently beside them while people passed carrying expensive shopping bags. Most ignored Caleb. Some stared. A few whispered. He recognized that look. The look people gave when poverty made them uncomfortable. Not cruel exactly, just distant. Like hardship might spread if they stood too close. By late afternoon, clouds gathered above the mountains, dark and low. Wind shifted colder than usual. Ranger suddenly stopped near the truck and stared toward the hills above Aspen Ridge. Completely still, ears raised, tail unmoving. Caleb frowned slightly. "What is it?" The dog did not respond. just kept watching the hillside near the luxury neighborhood, then slowly walked toward the edge of the parking lot where dirt met cracked pavement. Nose lowered, sniffing something invisible. Caleb followed. Wet soil. Nothing unusual. Yet Ranger kept circling one patch near a drainage ditch before pawing lightly at the ground once. Then again, Caleb crouched beside him. The dirt felt softer than expected, almost loose beneath the surface. Strange after several dry days. He looked uphill toward the massive homes perched against the mountain slope. Large retaining walls, fresh landscaping, heavy stone foundations. Everything looked expensive, permanent, untouchable. Yet something about the hill unsettled him suddenly. A quiet feeling, the kind he learned not to ignore during military years. Ranger looked back at him now, waiting, silent, serious. Wind moved harder through the valley while dark clouds swallowed the last sunlight over Aspen Ridge. Somewhere above town, thunder rolled softly against the mountains. And though Caleb could not explain why, for the first time in a long while, the hill no longer looked steady. Rain arrived before dawn and stayed longer than anyone expected. By sunrise, Aspen Ridge looked softer beneath the heavy gray sky, mist drifting between pine trees while mountain roads glistened with cold rainwater. Caleb Turner stood beneath the porch roof holding a steaming metal coffee cup, eyes fixed quietly on the hillside above town. Ranger stood beside him unusually still. The German shepherd had barely slept. Twice during the night, Caleb heard him pacing outside near the edge of the property, nose lifted toward the wind as if listening for something buried beneath the mountain itself. "You still thinking about yesterday?" Caleb asked softly. Ranger remained focused uphill, ears raised, unmoving. Caleb had learned long ago to trust silence more than panic. During military years, strange feelings often arrived before danger did. Small instincts, uneasy details, things people ignored until too late. Yet this felt different somehow. Not immediate danger. Something slower, hidden, patient. After breakfast, Caleb spent the morning repairing drainage trenches around his mud house. Rainwater moved carefully through shallow channels he dug years ago, using survival methods learned overseas. His house looked simple from the outside, but every inch served a purpose. Thick earth walls trapped warmth during winter. Stone foundation rested directly on solid ground. Water runoff moved naturally downhill, without pressure building beneath the structure. Caleb trusted the mountain, but only if people respected how it moved. Most did not. Around noon, an expensive black SUV stopped near the dirt road again. A woman stepped out wearing designer rain boots and a wool coat worth more than Caleb probably spent in months. Melissa Harper, local realtor, one of the loudest critics of his little house. She folded both arms while staring toward the muddy walls with obvious disapproval. "You know," she said without greeting, "some of us have spent years building this neighborhood into something respectable." Caleb kept working without looking up. "Morning to you too." Melissa sighed dramatically. "People are starting to complain again." "About what?" Caleb asked calmly. "Your house," she answered. "It lowers property values. Visitors drive through and think someone forgot to clean up after a storm." Ranger stepped closer quietly, standing beside Caleb without sound. Calm, protective. Melissa glanced at the dog and lowered her voice slightly. "You cannot honestly think this place belongs next to million-dollar homes." Caleb pushed mud from his gloves slowly. "Funny thing about homes," he said quietly. "Most people think expensive means safe." Melissa laughed softly. "Well, some of us prefer walls that actually look finished." Before Caleb could answer, Ranger suddenly moved. The dog walked several feet toward the hillside, nose low against soaked earth. Sniffing again, circling, stopping near the same drainage line from yesterday. Completely focused. Caleb frowned. "Ranger." The dog scratched once at wet soil before standing perfectly still again. Melissa shook her head with visible amusement. "Even your dog looks confused living here." She turned back toward her SUV. "Honestly, Caleb, I do not understand why you stay." Caleb watched her leave quietly, then looked toward Ranger. Rainwater flowed strangely through the drainage ditch above the hill. Not normal runoff. Too cloudy. Soil mixed into water heavier than expected. Caleb crouched beside the ground, pressed fingers into soaked dirt. Soft, almost hollow underneath. His expression shifted slightly. Something about the hillside felt wrong. He stood and looked higher toward the luxury homes sitting against the slope. Massive retaining walls stretched behind landscaped yards. Stone patios. Fresh pine mulch. Decorative waterfalls. Heavy foundations. Beautiful from far away. But mountains remembered pressure differently than people did. Caleb knew terrain. Knew movement. Knew how disasters sometimes whispered long before they shouted. That afternoon, he drove toward the upper neighborhood to check something. Ranger rode silently beside him, eyes fixed ahead. Aspen Ridge Heights looked untouched by ordinary life. Perfect lawns despite rain. Massive windows overlooking valleys below. Luxury trucks lined spotless driveways. Everything expensive. Everything polished. Caleb parked near a walking trail overlooking the hillside. Ranger stepped out immediately and pulled toward a narrow drainage area running beneath several properties. The dog moved faster now. Focused. Nose pressed low against wet earth. Then suddenly stopped. Completely frozen. Caleb followed and crouched beside him. Fresh cracks stretched through muddy ground near the edge of the slope. Small. Thin. Easy to miss unless someone looked carefully. Water trickled strangely beneath loose soil. Caleb stood slowly. His jaw tightened. That should not be moving, he murmured quietly. Nearby, two homeowners walking beneath umbrellas noticed him standing near the hillside. One older man frowned immediately. Can we help you? Caleb turned politely. You might want somebody checking drainage around here. The woman beside the man looked confused. Excuse me. Caleb nodded toward the ground. Soil feels unstable after the rain. The older man laughed softly. You are the mud house guy, right? Caleb said nothing. Pretty sure our engineers know more than a guy living in dirt, the man added with a smile. The couple walked away laughing quietly beneath umbrellas. Ranger remained staring at the ground. Still uneasy. Caleb exhaled slowly. He had seen this before. Not mountains. Not homes. But human certainty. The dangerous kind. The kind that believed money solved problems faster than truth. Rain grew heavier overhead as thunder rolled low through distant hills. Before heading home, Caleb looked once more toward the expensive homes lining the ridge. Beautiful houses. Perfect views. Yet somehow, standing there beside Ranger, they no longer looked steady. And if you enjoy stories about loyalty, hidden truths, and second chances, please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss more unforgettable stories still ahead. By the time Caleb drove back toward the little mud house, Ranger had not stopped watching the mountain once. The rain did not stop for 3 straight days. By the 4th morning, Aspen Ridge felt quieter than usual, as though the mountain itself had grown heavy beneath the weather. Water slid endlessly through roadside gutters. Pine trees swayed under cold wind. Low clouds pressed close against the hills where million-dollar homes stood overlooking the valley below like they had nothing to fear. Caleb Turner stood outside his mud house near sunrise wearing an old rain jacket while steam rose slowly from black coffee resting between rough hands. Ranger stood several feet away near the drainage trench, unmoving again. Watching, listening, waiting. The dog had become restless in a way Caleb had not seen since their final deployment years ago. Not anxious, focused, like something invisible had shifted beneath the surface. Still thinking about that hill? Caleb asked quietly. Ranger glanced toward him briefly before turning back uphill again. Caleb exhaled slowly. He trusted instincts, especially the dog's. More than once, Ranger had sensed danger long before human eyes ever noticed it. Strange sounds beneath floors. Weak ground beneath camps. A hidden person lost in heavy woods during storms. The dog simply knew things sometimes. Yet mountains were different. Harder to read. Less forgiving. After breakfast, Caleb grabbed a shovel and drove toward Aspen Ridge Heights again. Ranger rode beside him silently, nose near the cracked passenger window while rain tapped softly against the windshield. Luxury homes lined the hillside in perfect rows beneath fog. Expensive stone walls. Massive windows. Heated garages. Everything designed to look permanent. Caleb parked near yesterday's trail and walked back toward the drainage slope Ranger had fixated on. The soil looked worse now. What had been small cracks yesterday stretched farther this morning, thin lines moving through wet dirt like veins beneath skin. Water pooled where runoff should have drained faster. Caleb crouched near the slope and pushed one gloved hand into the mud. Too soft. Wrong kind of movement beneath the surface. Loose. Hollow almost. Ranger moved farther uphill suddenly, nose low, paws careful through soaked ground. then stopped sharply beside a concrete drainage grate near one mansion's retaining wall. The dog scratched lightly once, then stood completely still. Caleb walked over slowly. Water barely trickled through the drainage opening despite days of heavy rain. Strange. It should have been moving fast. He crouched lower and used the shovel to clear loose mud near the edge. Something underneath looked blocked. Old debris. Broken pipe fragments maybe. Caleb frowned. That is not right, he murmured. Behind him, a sharp voice interrupted the quiet. What exactly do you think you are doing? Caleb stood slowly. A tall man in an expensive raincoat approached from one of the nearby driveways. Late 50s. Perfect haircut. Frustration already written across his face. Caleb recognized him from town meetings. Thomas Grayson, head of the Homeowners Association. Just checking the drainage, Caleb answered calmly. Thomas looked at the shovel with visible irritation. On private property? I am standing near a public runoff line. Thomas crossed his arms. You live in that dirt cabin at the bottom of the hill, right? Caleb stayed quiet. Thomas shook his head. Look, we already heard about your little theories. He gestured toward the slope dismissively. We hired engineers. This neighborhood cost millions to build. Ranger stood beside Caleb now, eyes fixed toward the hill rather than the conversation. Alert. Listening. Thomas noticed the dog and sighed impatiently. Your dog digging around here is not helping either. Caleb looked toward the soft earth near the retaining wall. I think you should have someone double-check the hillside. Thomas laughed softly, almost amused. Because a homeless veteran and his dog suddenly became geology experts? Rain fell harder between them. Caleb lowered his eyes briefly before speaking again. Calm. Steady. I know unstable ground when I see it. Thomas smiled politely in the way people smiled before dismissing someone completely. With respect, Caleb, I think we are doing just fine. At that exact moment, Ranger suddenly turned sharply uphill and barked once. Not loud. Short. Serious. Caleb followed the dog's gaze. Somewhere higher along the slope, small rocks rolled softly through wet brush before disappearing into the rain. Tiny movement. Easy to miss. But movement all the same. Caleb's jaw tightened. You need someone out here, he said quietly. Thomas shook his head. What we need is for people to stop trespassing. He turned back toward his house without another word. Ranger remained staring toward the hill. Completely focused now. Caleb crouched beside him slowly. You are sure about this, huh? Ranger pressed one paw lightly against wet ground near the drainage line. Caleb looked again toward the homes standing tall against the mountain. Beautiful houses. Strong walls. Expensive certainty. Yet something about them no longer felt secure. By afternoon, rain turned colder. Caleb stopped at the local library on his way home, an old brick building near town square where few people visited anymore. Something about the blocked drainage kept bothering him. Mountains rarely failed without warning. Somebody somewhere usually knew the land had weaknesses long before construction started. The librarian, an older man named Peter, recognized Caleb immediately. Back for weather books? He joked gently. Caleb smiled faintly. Actually, I am looking for old land records. Peter raised an eyebrow. What kind? Caleb glanced toward the rain outside, darkening the windows. Anything about hillside development near Aspen Ridge Heights. Peter paused longer than expected, then slowly nodded. That area, he said quietly. You might want the archived county maps downstairs. Something in the old man's tone unsettled Caleb more than he expected. Outside, thunder rolled low through the mountains again, while Ranger stood beside the truck staring toward the hill, as though whatever worried him had only just begun. The county archive room smelled faintly of old paper and dust, the kind of quiet place people forgot existed until they needed answers nobody else wanted to find. Rain tapped steadily against the basement windows while fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. Caleb Turner stood beside a long wooden table covered in rolled maps and faded documents, weathered hands moving carefully through decades of county land records. Ranger rested nearby at first, calm but unusually alert, head lifted every few minutes toward the ceiling as though listening to the storm above. Peter, the librarian, returned carrying another stack of files. You were right to ask about that hill, he said quietly, lowering the box onto the table. Caleb looked up. What do you mean? Peter hesitated for a moment. Before Aspen Ridge Heights was developed, that land had problems. He pulled free a yellowed engineering report with faded county stamps. Small landslides mostly. Drainage concerns. Soil instability after heavy snowmelt. Caleb frowned slightly. Then why build million-dollar homes there? Peter gave a tired shrug. Money has a way of changing people's memory. Caleb opened the report carefully. The pages carried diagrams of underground water movement, warnings highlighted in red ink, notes from geologists recommending limited construction near the hillside due to unstable clay beneath rocky surface layers. One phrase caught his attention immediately. Potential slope failure during extended rainfall. Caleb sat back slowly. Outside, thunder rolled again. Not sharp, low and distant. The kind of sound mountains swallowed whole. Ranger suddenly stood and walked toward the stairwell leading upstairs. Ears raised. Waiting. Caleb watched him briefly. What is it? The dog stayed motionless for several seconds before finally returning. Restless again. Like unfinished worry lived somewhere outside the walls. Caleb continued reading. 10 years earlier, developers proposed drainage systems meant to reduce pressure beneath the hillside. Yet later documents showed changes made during construction. Budget reductions. Alternative runoff plans. Missing inspection signatures. Caleb's jaw tightened slowly. Somebody cut corners, he murmured quietly. Peter nodded. People questioned it at the time. What happened? Peter smiled sadly. Expensive lawyers happened. Silence settled between them for a moment while rain grew harder overhead. Caleb folded the map carefully. The luxury neighborhood sat directly above drainage channels meant to carry mountain runoff safely beneath the slope. If those systems failed, water would start moving underground where nobody could see it. Softening soil. Weakening foundations. Slowly at first. Quietly. The dangerous kind of quiet. By late afternoon, Caleb loaded copies of maps into an old folder and headed home. Ranger jumped into the truck immediately, but instead of lying down like usual, the German shepherd sat upright staring toward the hills. Watching. The rain had turned colder now. Streams of water crossed roads where runoff overflowed onto pavement. As Caleb turned toward the dirt road near his house, something caught his attention uphill. Emergency vehicles. 2 police SUVs parked outside one of the larger homes near Aspen Ridge Heights. Caleb slowed slightly. Ranger stood instantly, paws against the dashboard. Alert. Focused. Caleb pulled onto the shoulder and stepped out beneath light rain. Across the slope, several neighbors gathered near the Grayson property, umbrellas raised while voices drifted faintly through wind. Something felt different. Uneasy. Caleb walked closer but stopped near the road. Through the trees, he could see construction tape stretched loosely across one section of driveway. Workers examined the foundation near the front steps. One side of the stone walkway had shifted slightly downward. Not much, but enough. Thomas Grayson stood nearby, arguing with someone wearing a county inspection jacket. Caleb stayed quiet. Ranger remained beside him, ears fixed forward. Then Caleb noticed it. A long crack running across the lower retaining wall near the property edge. Thin but unmistakable. Water trickled through it steadily. Caleb exhaled slowly. It started, he whispered under his breath. One of the workers noticed him standing nearby. You cannot be here, the man called politely. Caleb nodded once and started back toward the truck. No reason to argue. No reason to say I told you so. Not yet. Yet before he turned fully away, Thomas spotted him. Even from a distance, embarrassment flashed briefly across the man's face before frustration quickly replaced it. He walked several steps forward. Nothing serious, Thomas said loudly enough to be heard. Minor settling issue. Caleb looked once toward the cracked retaining wall. Hope you are right. Thomas crossed his arms defensively. Our engineers are handling it. Caleb glanced toward Ranger, who remained staring at the hill instead of the people. Might want them looking higher up too, Caleb said quietly. Thomas shook his head immediately. We do not need panic. Caleb said nothing else. Sometimes truth sounded insulting before people were ready for it. Back at the mud house, evening settled heavily across the valley. Wind pushed rain sideways while clouds swallowed the mountain entirely. Caleb lit a lantern inside and spread the county maps across his kitchen table. Ranger paced near the front door again. Restless. Focused. Every so often the dog stopped and looked toward the hill above town. Listening. Caleb traced old drainage routes with one finger. Something did not add up. The blocked runoff near the hillside. Missing inspections. Weak soil. cracks beginning already after only days of rain. Then suddenly, outside in the darkness, a distant sound rolled faintly through the valley. Deep. Strange. Not thunder. Caleb looked up immediately. Ranger froze near the door, ears forward, completely still. Somewhere above Aspen Ridge Heights, something heavy had shifted in the mountain. Caleb Turner barely slept that night. Rain moved across the mountain in steady waves while cold wind pressed softly against the mud house walls, carrying sounds too distant to fully understand. Around midnight, the deep rumble came again. Not thunder. Lower. Longer. Like something beneath the mountain had shifted and settled into a different shape. Ranger stood near the front window immediately, body completely still. Ears raised. Amber eyes fixed toward the darkness above Aspen Ridge Heights. Caleb pulled on his boots without speaking. Experience had taught him something simple years ago. When Ranger listened that carefully, something mattered. Outside, the night air smelled heavier than before. Wet soil. Pine needles. Moving water. Caleb stood near the edge of his property, looking uphill where faint lights from luxury homes glowed through rain and fog. Everything looked peaceful from far away. Too peaceful. Ranger walked several feet ahead before stopping near one of the shallow drainage channels Caleb dug years earlier. Water flowed steadily through it exactly how it should. Controlled. Directed. Stable. Caleb looked uphill again toward the expensive retaining walls holding entire properties against the slope. Too much water, he murmured softly. Nowhere for it to go. Morning arrived beneath thick, gray skies. Rain finally slowed, but the mountain still looked soaked through. Caleb brewed coffee and unfolded the old county maps again across his kitchen table while Ranger paced quietly nearby. The more Caleb studied the drainage diagrams, the worse everything looked. Several runoff systems originally designed beneath Aspen Ridge Heights had never been fully completed. Others appeared rerouted during construction to cut costs. Water that should have traveled safely beneath reinforced channels instead moved naturally through unstable soil. Slow. Hidden. Dangerous. Caleb leaned back heavily. They build a neighborhood on borrowed time, he said quietly. Ranger stopped pacing and looked toward the door again. Restless. Around mid-morning, Caleb drove uphill once more. This time the neighborhood felt different. Uneasy. Workers stood outside several properties inspecting cracks along driveways and retaining walls. Mud-stained sidewalks where runoff had overflowed. Homeowners gathered beneath umbrellas speaking quietly with worried faces. Nobody laughed at the mud house today. Caleb parked near the same trail and walked slowly toward the damaged Grayson property. Ranger moved ahead, nose low to the ground again, then suddenly stopped beside another drainage area farther uphill. The dog scratched hard once at wet earth before stepping backward. Caleb crouched immediately. Soft mud crumbled beneath one hand. Beneath it sat part of an old drainage pipe nearly crushed inward, clogged with rocks, roots, and compacted dirt. Water pooled behind it without moving properly. Caleb stared for several seconds. "That is your problem," he whispered. Nearby voices drifted closer. Thomas Grayson approached again, though this time the confidence in his posture looked thinner somehow. "What now?" Thomas asked, frustration mixed with concern. Caleb stood slowly. "You need county engineers out here immediately." Thomas folded his arms defensively, though worry showed plainly now. "We already have inspectors." Caleb pointed quietly toward the hillside. "That drainage system is failing." Thomas glanced down, but said nothing. Caleb continued. "Water is backing into unstable ground. The hill is moving." One woman standing nearby overheard them. "Moving?" she asked nervously. Caleb nodded once. "Calm. Steady. Slowly for now." Silence settled between them. Rain dripped softly from tree branches overhead. Then suddenly someone shouted farther uphill. "Come look at this." Several people moved quickly toward one of the larger homes overlooking the valley. Caleb followed at a distance. Ranger remained close beside him. The backyard patio of a massive stone mansion had shifted overnight. Not collapsed, but uneven now. One side noticeably lower than before. Long hairline cracks stretched through expensive stonework. Near the edge of the property, decorative landscaping had begun slipping slowly downhill. A woman wrapped tightly in a coat stood frozen near the back door. "That was not there yesterday," she whispered. Caleb looked quietly toward the retaining slope behind the home. Fresh, wet earth bulged outward unnaturally. Small rocks rolled loose every few minutes. Ranger suddenly stepped forward and stood facing uphill again, completely rigid, watching, listening. Caleb felt it then too. Something subtle beneath his boots. Not shaking exactly. More like soft settling under pressure. Slow movement deep underground. Easy to ignore if someone wanted comfort more than truth. Caleb looked toward Thomas again. You cannot keep pretending this is minor, he said quietly. Thomas rubbed one hand across his face, rain mixing with frustration. What are you saying? Caleb glanced toward the soaked mountain above them. I think the whole hillside is under stress. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody looked away either. The woman near the house crossed her arms tightly. Can it be fixed? Caleb hesitated. Maybe, he answered honestly. But first people need to stop pretending everything is normal. Ranger turned suddenly and pulled uphill several steps before stopping again near another section of wet earth. Nose low, focused, like the dog had not finished showing them something yet. Caleb followed slowly. Behind him, homeowners exchanged nervous looks for the first time since the rain began. Expensive houses still stood beautiful against the mountain. Large windows reflected gray skies. Stone walls looked solid from a distance. Yet now, standing close enough to hear water moving somewhere beneath the hill, even the wealthiest homes in Aspen Ridge no longer felt permanent. And somewhere deep below the mountain, something still seemed to be quietly shifting. The rain finally stopped sometime before dawn, but the mountain did not feel lighter. If anything, Aspen Ridge felt strangely quiet beneath the pale gray morning sky, the kind of silence that arrived after something invisible had already begun changing. Caleb Turner stood outside the mud house with coffee warming both hands while cold mist drifted low across the valley. Ranger stood near the edge of the property again, staring uphill toward the luxury homes with the same steady focus that had unsettled Caleb for days now. The dog had not relaxed once. Not fully. Even now, standing in soft morning light, Ranger looked as though he expected the mountain to say something nobody else could hear. Caleb looked toward the hillside. I know, he said quietly. I feel it too. By 7 o'clock, county trucks had started arriving near Aspen Ridge Heights. Word spread quickly after homeowners reported new cracks overnight. Driveways shifted slightly. Decorative stone fences leaned unevenly. One garage door refused to close because the frame no longer lined up correctly. Small problems by themselves. But mountains rarely warned people all at once. Trouble usually arrived piece by piece until suddenly nobody remembered when things first started going wrong. Caleb drove uphill after breakfast. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, eyes fixed ahead. This time nobody laughed when the old truck rolled into the neighborhood. Nobody whispered about the mud house. Fear had a way of changing conversations. The neighborhood looked different now. Concern moved through the streets like weather. Homeowners gathered outside holding coffee cups they barely drank. Contractors walked between properties carrying measuring tools and clipboards. County workers examined drainage lines while speaking quietly into radios. Near the Grayson property, caution tape stretched farther than yesterday. The retaining wall crack had widened overnight. Not dramatically, but enough to notice immediately. Thomas Grayson stood nearby staring toward his backyard with both hands inside his coat pockets. He looked older somehow. Tired. Caleb stepped out quietly. Thomas glanced toward him and hesitated before speaking. You were right about something, he admitted carefully. Caleb looked toward the damaged slope. I wish I was not. Thomas rubbed one hand across his forehead. Engineers are saying the hill may be saturated deeper than expected. Ranger moved past them suddenly and headed uphill toward another property farther along the ridge. Purposeful again. Focused. Caleb followed immediately. Thomas hesitated before walking behind them. They crossed several driveways before reaching a large stone house overlooking the valley. A woman stood outside near the front porch speaking nervously on the phone. Melissa Harper, the realtor who once mocked Caleb's mud house almost daily. She looked exhausted now, hair tied carelessly back, expensive coat soaked from rushing outside too quickly. Ranger stopped near the edge of her front lawn and lowered his nose toward the ground. Then he froze. Completely still. Caleb crouched beside him immediately. The earth beneath the grass felt softer than before. Too soft. A faint line stretched through the lawn toward the side of the house. Barely visible. But there. Melissa walked toward them quickly. What is happening? She asked nervously. Gone was the sharp voice from days before. Gone was the judgment. My patio shifted overnight. Caleb stood slowly. You might want to stay out of the backyard for now. Melissa swallowed hard. Is the house safe? Caleb glanced uphill, then down toward the valley below. I do not know yet. Behind them, a county inspector arrived carrying maps. We are asking homeowners to prepare for possible temporary evacuation if conditions worsen, he said carefully. The words landed heavier than expected. Several nearby homeowners overheard and immediately began asking questions all at once. Evacuate? For how long? This neighborhood was built less than 10 years ago. How could this happen? Nobody seemed angry yet. Mostly confused. Disbelieving. As though expensive things were supposed to stay safe forever simply because they cost more. Ranger suddenly pulled away again. Faster this time. He moved toward the upper drainage channel near a cluster of homes overlooking the steepest section of hillside. Caleb followed closely. Thomas and Melissa behind him now. The dog stopped near another drainage opening hidden behind decorative landscaping stones. Water trickled weakly beneath mud and debris. Caleb knelt immediately and pushed wet leaves aside. The channel underneath looked nearly blocked. Worse than the first one. Water had nowhere to go except beneath the soil itself. Caleb looked uphill toward 3 homes sitting directly above the slope. Beautiful houses. Massive windows reflecting sunlight finally breaking through clouds. Yet one retaining edge looked uneven now, tilted slightly forward. Ranger stepped backward slowly, ears raised high. Alert again. Caleb felt the same uneasy pressure in his chest from military years. Not panic. Timing. The kind of feeling that arrived moments before situations changed. We need people away from this side, Caleb said quietly. Thomas frowned. Right now? Caleb nodded once. Right now. Before anyone could answer, a deep sound moved faintly through the hillside again. Soft at first, almost hidden beneath wind. Then louder. Not a collapse. More like earth settling somewhere underneath. Several homeowners turned immediately. Silence spread. One woman covered her mouth. Farther uphill, small rocks rolled gently from beneath decorative landscaping near one property line. Melissa whispered softly, almost to herself. Oh my God. Caleb looked toward the county inspector. Call it in, he said calmly. The mountain is still moving. And for the first time since the storm began, nobody argued with the man from the mud house. The county evacuation warning came just after noon. Not mandatory yet. Only precautionary, officials said. But fear had already started moving faster than facts through Aspen Ridge Heights. Expensive SUVs lined driveways while families packed overnight bags into trunks that had probably never carried anything heavier than groceries. Contractors moved equipment. County engineers walked property lines with serious faces. Nobody smiled anymore. Nobody stood around laughing about the mud house at the bottom of the hill. Caleb Turner stood near the damaged drainage channel while cold mountain wind pushed through wet pine trees overhead. Ranger remained beside him, unusually tense. The German Shepherd had barely stopped moving all morning, pacing between weakened sections of hillside, as though trying to understand something humans kept missing. Caleb watched county workers place warning markers near unstable ground. The soil had shifted again. Small at first, barely noticeable unless someone knew where to look. But now cracks stretched farther across lawns. Decorative stone edging leaned unevenly. One backyard fence sat nearly 2 inches lower than the day before. The mountain was still changing. Slowly, quietly. Ranger suddenly lifted his head sharply and turned uphill again. Ears forward. Body stiff. Caleb noticed it immediately. What is it? The dog moved fast this time. Not running wildly. Purposeful. Focused. He crossed between 2 properties near the upper ridge, pulling Caleb with him toward a steep section behind several homes overlooking the valley. Ranger, Caleb called quietly. The dog stopped near a narrow walking path hidden between pine trees and retaining walls. Nose low, watching the earth. Caleb crouched beside him and immediately noticed fresh movement. Wet soil had begun separating near the path. Small cracks widening beneath loose stone. Not dangerous yet, but wrong. Very wrong. Then he heard voices nearby. A young couple stood outside one of the larger homes arguing softly while loading suitcases into their SUV. 2 children sat inside the vehicle watching through fogged windows. Caleb recognized the uneasy look in the parents' faces. They were trying to stay calm for their kids, trying not to panic. Ranger suddenly stepped farther uphill again. Faster now. Then stopped abruptly near the edge of another retaining slope behind the neighboring property. The dog barked once. Short, sharp, serious. Caleb moved immediately. What he saw made his chest tighten. A long section of wet earth had shifted nearly 3 inches downward near one side of the slope. Fresh mud pressed outward beneath heavy decorative landscaping stones. Water seeped steadily through loosened soil. Pressure building underneath. Caleb looked uphill toward 3 homes sitting directly above the movement. Too close. Too much weight. He turned back quickly toward the young father loading bags. You need to move your family now, Caleb said calmly, but firmly. The man frowned. Excuse me. Caleb pointed toward the slope. Ground movement. You are too close. The mother stepped closer immediately, fear already visible in her expression. Is it dangerous? Caleb nodded once. I would not wait. Before either parent could respond, Ranger barked again. Louder this time. Not panic. Warning. Caleb turned quickly. Small rocks had begun rolling softly from farther uphill. Not fast, but steady. Quiet movement through soaked soil. County workers farther down the ridge noticed too. One engineer looked toward the hillside and immediately grabbed his radio. We need upper properties cleared now, he shouted. Suddenly, everything moved faster. Calm voices turned urgent. Families began carrying bags toward cars. County staff knocked on doors. Homeowners called neighbors. The wealthy neighborhood that once looked untouchable suddenly felt fragile beneath the mountain. Caleb stayed moving, helping elderly residents step carefully across slick driveways, carrying bags for one older couple struggling down stone steps. Ranger moved constantly between houses, stopping whenever something seemed wrong. Once near a side yard where fresh cracks widened through soaked grass. Again beside a retaining wall beginning to lean outward. Every time, Caleb trusted the dog. Melissa Harper approached carrying 2 boxes toward her vehicle, visibly shaken. Gone was the polished confidence she always carried. I should have listened to you, she said quietly. Caleb accepted one heavy box without hesitation. You are listening now, he answered gently. Her eyes lowered briefly. I laughed at you. Caleb shrugged lightly. Hard times teach people strange lessons. Nearby, Thomas Grayson helped county workers move sandbags while speaking urgently into his phone. Pride looked smaller on him now. Reality had a way of making expensive titles matter less. Around sunset, evacuation teams finally closed access to several upper streets. The mountain still had not failed, not collapsed, but engineers no longer trusted what lay beneath the surface. Caleb stood near the edge of the neighborhood, watching emergency lights flicker softly against wet roads while cold evenings settled over Aspen Ridge. Ranger sat quietly beside him for the first time all day, still alert, but calmer now, like the dog knew people were finally listening. Far below, Caleb could see his little mud house resting safely against the lower hillside, lantern glowing warmly through the window. Small, humble, steady. The same house people mocked only days ago now stood untouched, while million-dollar homes waited nervously against shifting ground. Caleb rested one hand gently against Ranger's neck. You tried to warn them, he said softly. Ranger looked once more toward the dark mountain before settling quietly beside him. Somewhere beneath the hillside, water still moved through hidden places nobody wanted to believe existed. But for the first time since the storm began, the town had stopped laughing long enough to hear the truth. The evacuation lasted through the night. Aspen Ridge no longer looked like the polished mountain town people showed in vacation brochures. Streets once lined with luxury vehicles now sat strangely empty beneath flashing county lights. Temporary barriers blocked upper roads. Engineers worked beneath portable floodlights while rain-soaked earth glistened under cold mountain air. Yet somehow, despite all the fear moving quietly through town, the mountain held. Not stable, not safe, but holding. Caleb Turner woke before sunrise inside the little mud house, the same way he always did. Coffee warming between weathered hands. Ranger lying near the front door, finally asleep after days of restless pacing. For the first time in nearly a week, the German shepherd looked calm. Caleb stepped outside onto the porch. Morning mist drifted low through the valley while pale sunlight touched distant pine trees. Aspen Ridge Heights sat quiet above him, no longer shining with confidence. Expensive homes still stood, but uncertainty had settled over them now like weather. Caleb looked toward the hill for a long moment. Guess they finally listened, he said softly. Ranger opened one eye before resting again. Around mid-morning, Caleb drove into town for supplies. The atmosphere felt different immediately. Familiar, but changed somehow. People who once looked through him now looked directly at him. A few nodded politely. One man outside the hardware store even tipped his hat. Strange how quickly respect arrived once fear replaced judgment. Caleb grabbed feed, coffee, and extra dog food before stopping near the farmer's market. Dorothy stood arranging pies again beneath a small tent, bundled tightly against cold wind. Her face brightened immediately. There he is, she said warmly. The whole town has been talking about you. Caleb smiled faintly. I would rather they talked about the weather. Dorothy laughed softly. Too late for that. Before Caleb could answer, footsteps approached behind him. He turned and paused. Melissa Harper stood there holding a cardboard tray with 2 coffees. Gone was the sharp confidence she carried only days earlier. Her expression looked tired. Honest somehow. Can we talk? She asked quietly. Caleb hesitated before nodding once. They walked a short distance toward a bench overlooking the valley while Ranger settled nearby beneath the table. Melissa stared at her coffee for several seconds before speaking. I owe you an apology. Caleb stayed quiet. She exhaled slowly. I judged you, she continued softly. I laughed at your house. I said awful things. Her voice lowered. Then when things got bad, you still helped us. Wind moved gently between them. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rang softly through town. Caleb looked toward the mountains before answering. Fear makes people strange, he said calmly. Melissa swallowed hard. No, pride does. Silence settled for a moment. Then she looked toward him carefully. I do not think I ever really saw you before. Caleb smiled faintly. Most people only notice what looks expensive. Melissa laughed softly despite herself, though her eyes looked close to tears. You know what the strangest part is? She asked. Caleb raised an eyebrow slightly. Your house. What about it? County engineers checked everything yesterday, she said. Out of all the properties near the slope, your place is probably the safest structure in town. Caleb looked down briefly. Years ago, when he built the mud house, people mocked every decision. Rain channels carved by hand. Thick walls packed carefully for insulation and stability. Stone foundation laid directly into solid earth. Nothing fancy, just practical. Built slow. Built carefully. Built to survive weather rather than impress neighbors. Ranger lifted his head suddenly when another familiar voice approached. Thomas Grayson stood nearby, hands in coat pockets. No expensive confidence left. No irritation. Just tired honesty. Mind if I sit? He asked quietly. Caleb nodded. Thomas lowered himself carefully onto the bench and looked out toward the hills. I was wrong about you, he admitted after a long silence. Caleb said nothing. Thomas continued anyway. I spent years thinking money meant control. He shook his head slightly. Turns out mountains do not care about money. Caleb almost smiled at that. No, he said quietly. They usually do not. Thomas looked toward Ranger resting nearby. That dog knew before any of us did. Ranger glanced up briefly before lowering his head again. Melissa wiped quietly at her eyes. People are talking about setting up a community meeting, she said. Helping families while repairs happen. Thomas nodded slowly. And someone suggested asking if you would help explain what the mountain is doing. Caleb looked surprised for the first time in days. Me? Thomas gave a small tired smile. People finally realized you actually know things. The irony settled softly between them. Days ago, they laughed when Caleb drove through town. Now they wanted answers. Trust. Guidance. Caleb looked toward the distant hillside again, where sunlight finally reached the damaged neighborhood. Beautiful homes still stood there, uncertain now. Fragile in ways nobody expected. Yet farther below sat the little mud house everyone mocked. Quiet. Solid. Unshaken. Caleb reached down and scratched gently behind Ranger's ear. The dog leaned closer without opening his eyes. And somewhere deep inside, something long missing began returning to Caleb slowly. Not pride. Not revenge. Something quieter than that. Belonging. 3 months later, Aspen Ridge looked different. Not rebuilt exactly. Changed. Quieter somehow. The mountain still stood where it always had, wrapped in tall pine trees and cold morning mist, but people looked at it differently now. With more respect. More caution. County crews spent weeks repairing damaged drainage systems buried beneath the hillside. Engineers installed reinforcements where shortcuts had once replaced good decisions. Several luxury homes needed repairs. A few families stayed in temporary rentals while foundations stabilized. Yet somehow, despite everything, nobody forgot how close things had come to becoming much worse. Especially not the people who once laughed. Caleb Turner stood outside the mud house one crisp autumn morning, splitting firewood beneath soft golden sunlight. Leaves drifted slowly through cool air while Ranger rested nearby, watching the valley below with calm eyes. For the first time in weeks, the German shepherd looked peaceful again. No pacing, no restless listening, just quiet stillness. Caleb smiled faintly. "Looks like you can finally relax," he said softly. Ranger thumped his tail once against the porch. The little mud house looked almost beautiful now in ways Caleb had never noticed before. Morning light touched the packed earth walls warmly. Wildflowers grew near the hand-built stone path leading toward the porch. Someone from town had quietly repaired the old mailbox after winter storms bent it sideways. Another neighbor donated extra lumber without saying much. Strange how kindness sometimes arrived quietly after pride finally stepped aside. Around noon, Caleb drove into town for supplies. Main Street bustled gently beneath clear skies. People waved now. Not everyone, but enough to notice. Enough to feel different. Outside the coffee shop, Thomas Grayson stood waiting near a bench holding 2 paper cups. "Thought you might be passing through," he said awkwardly. Caleb raised an eyebrow slightly. "You waiting for me?" Thomas smiled faintly. "Guess I am." They sat overlooking town while Ranger settled comfortably nearby beneath the bench. For a while neither man said much. Wind moved softly through nearby trees. Church bells rang once in the distance. Finally Thomas looked toward the mountains. "Funny thing," he said quietly. "I used to think success meant having the biggest house." Caleb stayed quiet. Thomas laughed softly to himself. "Turns out it probably means sleeping at night without worrying if your walls are moving." Caleb smiled. "Solid ground matters." Thomas nodded slowly. "So do solid people." Before leaving, Thomas handed Caleb an envelope. "The community wanted to do something," he said. Caleb frowned slightly. "I do not need money." "It is not money," Thomas answered quickly. "Just open it later." Back at the mud house that evening, Caleb sat on the porch beside Ranger while sunset painted warm gold across distant hills. He finally opened the envelope carefully. Inside rested a small photograph from the recent town gathering. Caleb stood near the center beside Ranger while families smiled around them. Children, neighbors, people who once crossed streets to avoid him. Beneath the picture sat a handwritten note signed by dozens of residents. "Thank you for reminding us that strength does not always look expensive." Caleb stared quietly for a long moment. Ranger leaned gently against his leg. Then Caleb noticed something else folded beneath the letter. A small metal plaque request from town council. Curious, he unfolded it slowly. "Proposed community landmark, the Mud House Overlook." Suggested inscription. "Sometimes the strongest foundations are the ones nobody notices." Caleb laughed softly under his breath. Not because it felt funny exactly, because life had a strange sense of timing. Years ago, he lost everything he thought mattered. Career, home, future, even the woman he loved. People looked through him after that. Judged the old truck, the worn jacket, the little house made from mud and patience. Yet somehow, standing there now beneath fading sunlight beside the dog who never once stopped believing in him, Caleb realized something important. Losing everything had not broken him. It had simply stripped life down to what actually mattered. Loyalty, quiet work, honest kindness, and solid ground beneath your feet. Ranger suddenly lifted his head and looked toward the mountain one last time. Calm now, peaceful, then rested again beside Caleb. The hillside above Aspen Ridge still carried scars from the storm. Cracks repaired, walls reinforced, lessons learned the hard way. But below it all, resting quietly where laughter once echoed loudest, stood the little mud house no one respected until the mountain reminded them what strength really looked like. And as evening settled gently across the valley, Caleb leaned back in the old wooden chair while cool wind carried the scent of pine through fading light. Somewhere below, town windows began glowing warm against the dark. Somewhere above, the mountain stood silent once again. And for the first time in many years, Caleb no longer felt like a man standing outside the world. Perhaps the strongest homes are not the ones built to impress people. Perhaps they are the ones built carefully enough to endure when everything else begins to move.